Mr. Luke Ranieri, thank you very much for joining me today and agreeing to come talk to me. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Anthony. I really appreciate the chance.
Perfect. Um, so just before we move into the meat of the conversation and just to set up context for the listeners out there who don't know who you are, I thought briefly, can you just explain your journey into Latin, just for those who are
Ooh,
not aware of
yeah,
your experience? Yeah. So if you'd like to start with that, that'd be great.
sure. So I was in Italy. I was learning Italian back in 2005. I was there for a year in college, and I wanted to learn Italian. But of course, I was exposed in Italy to all of this inscription in Latin, and it was great. I was like, huh, this is, it feels like some kind of extension of Italian. I thought, no, I want to learn this language. And the I had to come back for the summer between the two semesters, came back to the US, and I picked up the rather famous book, Lingua Latina per se illustrata. And that first volume, Familia Romana, teaches everything you need to know about the basics of Latin grammar and vocabulary. So I realized once I got it, my hands on it, this is the key, this amazing thing, which has this cute little story and these characters in it. And it was teaching the syntax, because Latin syntax differs a lot from other modern languages in Western Europe, in that we don't necessarily have the verb as the second thing. The subject can happen almost anywhere in the sentence, that kind of thing. And so I decided to transcribe the whole thing. And which was kind of crazy. And I was 20 at the time, and I don't know if I would do that today. um, but I'm glad I did, because what I did is I would recite one of the sentences out loud, like the first sentence in the first chapter, which is Roma in Italia est, which is pretty clear. Most people can even understand that just from listening, maybe, especially if they've heard some Spanish or something. And I would say that sentence, and Italia in Europa est, and I would try to remember it and say it aloud to myself, and then I would transcribe it. I was typing it because I found that more effective for me, as opposed to writing it by hand, but whatever works for people. And that worked better for me. And I did that for the whole book. And so what I had done is I had spoken aloud multiple times, every single chapter, and done these multiple iterations. So after 3 months, I had complete basic reading fluency and a little bit of speaking ability.
Hmm. So
Yeah.
did learning Italian give you a very strong foundation into Latin then?
I think it helped a lot. I wouldn't say that for anyone who wants to learn Latin. I don't think you have to learn a Romance language, but it can help if one knows, for example, a couple of the more famous ones like Spanish or Italian. There's a lot that's familiar, a lot that's similar. Verb conjugations are really similar. Some idiomatic expressions are really similar, but a lot's different too. The modern Romance languages, for the most part, are more similar to each other than any of them is to Latin.
Hmm. And you mentioned Italy. You were learning Italian in Italy.
Hmm.
What was
In
the
Florence.
purpose of going to Italy? Was it just to learn the language?
It really was.
Just to learn it.
My father's parents were from Italy, and I'd always my dad speaks Italian too, and I wanted to go and learn Italian well, and I just it felt like something I really wanted to do and connect with. I grew up listening to a lot of classical music, a lot of Mozart's operas, especially the Italian ones, and yeah, I just felt this really strong affinity, and like I had to have that experience. And I think I was right, because it was very formative for me.
Yeah. And do you use Latin more than Italian these days?
Oh, much
Consider,
more. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Regrettably, I've allowed my skills in many modern languages, even to a degree, English, lapse utterly, because I find many times, since get the chance to speak Latin so much with students and friends and colleagues, that sometimes I just can't think of the right thing to say, even in English, much less Italian. My Italian friends get to be frustrated just a little bit. They're very patient with me when I use some kind of phrase or expression which comes to me naturally. Since of course, it's my own fault, I've associated the two languages together. They're similar, but not, they're certainly not identical.
Hmm.
And I'm like, wait, do you say that in Italian? And sometimes like, oh yeah, that sounds really old fashioned. Or sometimes they're like, no, what are you talking about? Uh,
Before you mentioned your own personal sort of language development strategies, so you would recite and transcribe things out loud. That really resonates because everyone has their own personal strategy. When I was learning Korean, the best thing that I found for me was trying to role play situations in real life and try to be those different people in real life. So I'll give you an example.
Mm.
I would say, if I went to a restaurant, I would pretend to be the waiter, and then I'll ask my imaginary self, what would you like to order? Things waiters say. And then at the same time, and then I would transition myself to be the customer. What would I respond to that if that actually happened? And this was great because when you're learning by yourself, especially in a different country in the UK where Korean is not spoken, you don't get these situations where you actually get to be in those real life situations. So, what better way to make it up yourself? I was wondering if you had any other sort of these personal language acquisition strategies
Oh
other
yeah,
than, yeah.
well, that's a great one, Anthony. Yeah, the role playing is huge because that's something that we kind of tend to do anyway. Our minds, for the most part, unless we're meditating, just never shut off. They're
Yeah.
constantly coming up with scenarios and thinking, and which is of course where regrets come from, and think, oh, I should have done this way or that way. But we can use that natural desire that our brains seem to have to want to overthink everything to our linguistic advantage by imagining those exact scenarios. So imagining being in the situation, I think, is brilliant, and that's how a lot of people have been able to teach themselves to speak Latin when they didn't have some kind of immersion environment to be able to find or to access. And that's what I did all the time. I found conversational Latin idioms and expressions, those books, textbooks that do that kind of thing. There's not a
Mm.
lot of them, but there was enough to get started. And so, yeah, I would imagine those situations. I would recite them. I would write a little bit of my own stories. Nothing I
Mm.
would show to the public just because they're tedious and not very interesting. But that kind of like keeping a journal entry,
Mm.
writing, and then saying things. I think making the auditory though is really, really a big part of it. And for me, I think I'm very interested in the auditory part of
Mm.
language, of the hearing and the speaking. So yeah, any exercise which makes that better, I think, is useful.
Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned that because you actually got to utilize it in a week long was it a week long seminar at the Latin
Yeah, eight
Conway Technique?
days.
8
Yeah,
days,
yeah.
with Professor Terence Thunberg, a
Hmm.
scholar in Latin literature and language. I think that's amazing.
Oh yeah. Well,
Um,
he's amazing. Yeah.
what was your sort of thought process before going and during the seminar? Were you nervous about going, meeting all these people who speak Latin at the same
Hmm.
level, or?
Yeah. Well, had no idea what to expect. I'd been studying Latin for 4 years at that time. It was in 2009 I went for the first time, and I went to a couple more, and more recently, past couple years. And yeah, I'd spent not you know, I'd spent a lot of 2005, but it was the end of it was the final years of college, of university. So I wasn't exclusively spending my time on Latin by any means, but it was something that had really become a little bit of a hobby. And I was starting to do some YouTube content and trying to do a podcast and things like that even
Mm.
back then. So I was really trying to make it this active spoken thing. And I like the idea of the revival of the Latin language as something that's spoken. And really, what I realized after that event, it's already been revived.
Mm.
And I'm glad I'm able to contribute what I do. But I'm thankfully a voice in a chorus. I'm not a
Mm.
voice in the desert, which is really nice. So, yeah, was I nervous? I like social situations, and because I had spent, like all the other people there, so much time invested in trying to get some kind of skill in the language, it's just this kind this mutual excitement of wanting to try to do this because we all know it's going to be good for us, and it's awkward, and you sign a little thing where you say, oh, I'm after the introductory dinner, I'm only going to, for the following 7 days, speak nothing but Latin with the participants, and only if you're in town or something, or you would speak English or whatever you like, but with the participants, and just to help keep that immersion experience. That was a very nice and important idea, and I found it just incredibly enjoyable. And it was just it was one of the highlights of that year for me.
Mm. Was
Yeah.
there? I mean, whenever I find someone else with a very niche passion, let's say, I don't know, maybe in the music example, say like a very, very obscure composer, and I find someone else who has the same passion as me for that composer. There's this very deep and unspoken connection with that person. You know, there's something that goes beyond just friendship. There's something a lot deeper because, you know, you're brought together to this particular moment and you're experiencing that particular moment together. Did you have that sort of deep connection with the other Latin speakers?
Instantly.
Instantly, yeah.
And that's a big part of it. I think that's an interesting. There's a shorthand, I think, which goes into that kind of human interaction. It could be something like, "Oh, you're a Star Trek fan, so am I," you know, and you'll get along on most of the things. You might have silly debates on who's better, Kirk or Picard, or something like that. But for the most part, you appreciate something instantly, and you're part of a kind of a tribe in a way. I think that's sort of the unconscious reaction that we have because if we've taken the time to learn about that composer, to learn the language or something, because learning a modern language, yeah, you can get affinity that way, but learning to speak an ancient language that not a lot of others speak, much more niche and therefore much more fraternity, I think, is instantly sensed. And if you've done all that work and I've done that too, then we already know the kind of person that we must be within certain limits. And so we're like, oh, I kind of accept you. But it could be, oh, you like this type of music or you don't, or that's a favorite movie, that's mine too. I think it works on all of these different levels. And I've noticed it also being in the military, even meeting not only because I've been in two branches of the US military, Air Force and Army, but not only do I find affinity with Marines or sailors in the US, but also with members of the militaries from countries that we work with, for example, British soldiers, Italian, German, Dutch, and working with them, even there too, is the same kind of affinity. Like, oh, you've done these things and you've gone through the basic training and all that. I have too. You don't say that necessarily. You don't need to say it. You already know that. So instantly there's a kind of, oh, I know that since you must have done those things, that makes you that kind of a person, and I must be that kind of person too. I assume that's what's going on in our minds.
That's great. Are you able to express very deep, abstract thoughts in Latin?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. In fact, some things I can only express in Latin.
Oh, really? And not so in English?
Yeah, because I spend so much time on the poetry and these really interesting ways of expressing things poetically that really can't be captured in a different language. Just as, for example, the best poetry in English can't be translated, nor can the best Latin poetry. And there's so much feeling that's tied into that. Just like a song, like it's like taking your favorite piano concerto and then having someone, I don't know, sing it or hum it. I mean, you get the melody, but is that the same thing?
That's such a good point. No, it won't be. It won't be. It'll be lost. There's a thing in Cantonese. A lot of people probably agree with me. Like Cantonese humor, or not just Cantonese humor. Cantonese insults are untranslatable. They're just the humor will be lost if it's translated, and it just sounds incredibly, painfully funny when it's spoken in Cantonese. And I think you're right. Some things just cannot be how do you say, transcribed to different language because the power of the language we lost through translation. And do you find yourself presenting yourself differently when you're speaking Latin as opposed to English?
That's an interesting question. I noticed that when I learned German in high school and Italian in college, and I noticed that exact phenomenon. I felt like my personality was a little bit different. I think there was two reasons. One was that since I was absorbing, when we learn language, when we acquire language, we're not only acquiring words, grammar, and syntax, but intonation's attached to personality and expression. So we take on the habits of our teachers. We take on, and a big one for me is in Italian, I gesticulate more. I use my hands more when I speak because, of course, every Italian that I've spoken with will use their hands more. And I do a lot of Italian things in Latin like that because I just use my familiarity with Spanish and Italian, and I try to give like a Romance language personality to my Latin. That's just my aesthetic preference. It works for me. And but I've found that the more languages I got to learn, I mean, another one where body language is really important is Japanese. When I got to learn and study Japanese, you know, my body language would change. I would get kind of an upper body rigidity and a lot of, you know, head movements and things like that, which are vital because language is not just the words; it's also, you know, that kind of body language too, especially when you're dealing with native speakers. Um, and so those little superficial aspects of personality can lead to like, I can't really express this either because of my own inability or because the language itself just doesn't have that little thing. I would feel that all the time, especially in Japanese,
Mm.
but there's all those things that Japanese can do that English and other languages cannot. So so what I found though was finally over time, and I think I really started to figure this out in Japan, once I was able to tell jokes and the same kind of humor I have anyway in English or whatever, and I was able to make native speakers laugh. Um,
Mm.
then I realized I was starting to express myself. And since a lot of what I've done is language based, I have a lot of language based jokes anyway in English, or a lot of puns, a lot of silly, you know, dad humor, like they call it, right? And and the oyaji gyagu, which they call it in Japanese, which means old man jokes. They apparently that's the lowest form of humor in Japanese culture. They laughed at my jokes anyway. It's the highest form of humor in French tradition, as if I recall, the pun. And but I found that for the most part, especially after that experience, the more I started using other languages, including Latin, the more I felt completely like myself and no difference at all between any of the languages.
Mm. I'm glad you mentioned humor. Um, do you think if you can make the person from the culture that the language you're learning, laugh, despite not being totally fluent, do you think that's a symbol of being a symbol of understanding that culture? So you can not be fluent, but if you can make them laugh, genuinely
Mm.
laugh,
Oh yeah.
do you think that's better than
Oh
being
yeah.
fluent and not making them laugh?
Oh yeah, especially I think it's super important, and I think it's a nice measure for myself if I'm able to, you know, even if it's really superficial humor, if I am telling a joke with the intent of making the native speaker laugh because I think it's funny, just as
Yeah.
I would to someone who speaks a language I know better or well or natively, like English, then that's, I think, a really successful language communication thing because humor is so ineffable, right? Like what it is and why we even laugh to begin with is
Mm.
so mysterious. I think we don't. I think a lot of the more you study humor, the more the more it makes it kind of not really humor anymore. I think
Yeah.
it's difficult, right? You start to break it
Yes.
down and then and you can kind of analyze elements. And some really great comedians, I think, have done that kind of thing successfully. But for the most part, yeah, I think it's really successful if you can make someone laugh in the native
Mm.
language.
Mm. Is are there any negative sort of connotations with learning Latin? Because when I was growing up, people who did classical music were seen as elitist and impenetrable and sort of pretentious. I think I got that a lot. Pretentious. People calling me pretentious because I played classical music.
Mm.
Um, are there any similar things happening to you when people hear that you're learning Latin?
For sure. And I now I'm self-taught, of course,
Mm,
in Latin and in Greek and other languages. I've had a lot of I've had immersion experiences too in both languages since I had started teaching myself. So I'm not like there's almost no one who's 100% self-taught, but I mean, but primarily I've never really taken any significant coursework.
mm,
So I never was, for example, in a high school or a college setting where high school, I guess, is where people would be petty like that. And they say, oh, you're pretentious because you're studying Latin or you're
yeah.
learning classical piano or something. But absolutely, those things exist. And I think that is ultimately a character about Latin and ancient Greek, which was fading in a good way slowly because of the ways that we teach Latin and ancient Greek now, myself, as well as many, many others around the world, is to teach them more like living languages, to teach them with an input-based approach. All languages until I think it was the earlier part of the 20th century, and a lot of the 19th century, any foreign language was taught with this kind of grammar-first approach, and then learning to translate. If we're native English speakers, then we'll translate from French into English as a way to learn the language. One can learn a lot about the language by doing translation, but it's a very ineffective method if it's used repeatedly, and especially exclusively as the way to actually acquire any language. And I recall this, and this is anecdotal because I haven't looked at a statistic, but soldiers then going from, say, the UK or the US into continental Europe during World War I were apparently utterly enfeebled, because they couldn't actually communicate in French or whatever other language they were trying to work with, because they had learned in this terrible way, which doesn't promote effective communication. It just teaches you to translate. And then they started to revamp the whole idea. And by the late 20th century, we have wonderful, famous programs like French in Action, which is still wonderfully freely available on the internet for people to enjoy, and others for Spanish and so forth. So the idea that languages should be learned in a communicative way or input-based, and that's a Stephen Krashen idea of comprehensible input. We can only learn something if we understand it. And so it's good to take something where you understand like 99% of it, or somewhere in there where you understand almost everything. You get a little bit, here's a new thing, and slowly build. It's a more enjoyable experience. And so that's a big part of it, because the way that Latin and ancient Greek, I would say primarily still, if we were taking just the statistics of students around the world, they're still being taught more in that grammar translation approach. But that's changing rapidly because people are readily learning, of all ages too. Teachers, of course, younger people who use the internet, I've grown up with it, like myself, are into that kind of diverse possibility. But nevertheless, I know people who are way up there, who are actively, completely changing how they teach. And I applaud every single one of them for saying, I'm going to try to learn to speak. I'm not going to be good at it, but I'm going to do it for the sake of my students, and they'll be better than me. Wonderful. And I laud that utterly.
Yes.
But as far as the elitism, the classics languages, of course, the classics community has had that reputation. But it's interesting because you don't necessarily have to deal with it, I think. If you want to learn to use Latin in a communicative way, you simply can, because there's so many tools available for us that we can teach ourselves and we can get good at, and we don't have to have that stigma attached.
Yeah. But there's quite a few points I want to just go back on there. I'm not sure if you watched the YouTuber Bold and Bankrupt.
I don't think I have.
He's this British guy that travels around, travels the world alone, and he makes vlogs about it. And he was in Russia, and he was just telling, I think someone commented on how he's so confident in talking to people in different languages because he can speak Russian very, very fluently. And you see him just go up to strangers and just have a full-on conversation as if they've been friends for a very long time. And he gave tips on how to be more confident in speaking. And he said that, sometimes focusing on grammar too much, you lose out on the time you could spend on learning vocabulary instead. And he said that if your grammar is, say, 50% fluent, but you have a lot of vocabulary in your head, if you just string together vocabulary with maybe 50% focus on grammar, natives will understand what you're trying to say. But if you're very, very fluent in grammar but have no vocabulary, you can't communicate at all.
Absolutely right.
But sorry, that's just a point I had to make.
Good one.
But what you said about just learning grammar, it brings me back to my time learning French in school, which was just learning about grammar, translating, and
it was still
that's Anthony,
this is sad. This is 21st century.
I know. And the exam would be you would prepare your script for exams, and then they would ask the question that you already know and you've written the answer for, and you just repeat it. That's
Oh,
it. So nothing
okay.
was off. Nothing was off the cuff. It was all like pre-planned and
It's
prepared. Very
interesting.
clinical and
It's easier to grade,
easier to
but it
grade.
doesn't mean it's a better language learning experience per se.
No,
It's harder to
exactly.
judge, you know, how
Yeah.
well is the student doing. And I think that's an attraction to why teachers who, even if part of them really wants to learn a more communicative approach to Latin, they nevertheless would find it, well, how do I grade that? I know how to grade
Yes.
translations, they would say,
Mm,
but how do I grade a student on the ability to understand a written text?
yes. Exactly. And I know that you also teach your students too. You're
Hmm.
also a teacher. How
Hmm.
do you conduct your own lessons?
Oh, that's a great question. So, the if it Latin, for example, I mentioned that Familia Romana book, which is just a wonderful thing, because for the most part, I teach online these days, and in doing that, if you and I were doing that lesson, we would look at the text, and the text is filled with pictures and marginal notes, and there's no English in it; it's just Latin. So, what I do is I give, if it's the first time the student is seeing that page or the text, I would given an orientation, like, okay, here's the map of the Roman Empire, and I would be saying this all in Latin, because there are teachers who may not be fluent. Since I'm very comfortable, but at the same time, it's important for me not to go like, blah 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 blah. I try to
Yeah.
keep it simple, but I would say, okay, here is the Roman Empire, here's Rome, here's Italy. I'm just pointing to stuff, and everything I'm saying is understood. They couldn't repeat it yet, but I'm saying, oh,
Mm,
Roma in Italia est, Italia in Europa est, Gallia quoque in Europa est. I've taken them through the whole tour with the map. That's the first page
mm,
of the book. The second page is actually the sentences I was just saying, which is Roma in Italia est, Roma's in Italy, Italia in Europa est, Gallia quoque in Europa est, Gaul is also in Europe, and just going through each one of them. Then, so first they get an input experience, and there's something I think pretty universal that everyone has gone through in school of, here's a map of whatever we're studying. It could be, of Europe or of Asia, wherever. And, we're pointing, and this is this, and this is this. I think pretty much everyone can understand that experience. And they can like, okay, that's that. And then they're able to, especially if they know the basic geography of Europe, then with that specific example of the Roman Empire, they're going to be quite comfortable.
mm,
Um, and then they get to see it. And then that's lesson one. And then I would stay in Latin as much as is necessary. But it depends on the student. Sometimes a student wants and craves that complete immersion. Sometimes students
mm,
just they're not quite comfortable yet, and they want to be like, wait a minute, is sunt the plural of are, like it's to be plural, and say, oh yeah, yes it is, or I might answer that like recte, like that. And then and they can do that. It's to force a student to then express every conceivable idea in the target language may not be good for most people in the
mm.
beginning, because if their stress level goes up, their learning ability goes down.
Yeah. Yeah. Are they quite young, your students?
No, I teach pretty much exclusively adults, but though I have had the opportunity to teach some younger kids, middle school age. I taught at middle school years ago, and as well as tutoring. But yeah, for the most part, adults. And I mean, it really, because some people are really good with teaching younger children, and I
Mm,
think I'm fine, but I definitely think I do better with like university age and higher, just because I don't know, maybe it's my sense of humor.
mm,
Maybe I'm too cerebral, or um, think, and I know too, because I've read about a lot of the good pedagogy that's good for middle school, high school age children. I know elementary school kids, they're getting taught Latin, which is an immersion experience, which is impressive that people do that.
mm,
But there's so much good pedagogical science to how to do that well.
mm.
Man, I've mostly studied the stuff that applies to adults, that I feel like I would really want to study that more if I were to do that again for younger aged folks. But yeah, but for the most part, the people who come to want to learn Latin, they do it voluntarily. Therefore, they have their own finances available. They either have something available through the university, or they're already have their own job and they're doing this on the side. So that's
Mm.
why usually we tend to get students who are adults.
Oh, that's fantastic. And there's when we were talking about, when you mentioned Latin being revived previously, what's your opinion on Latin being dead, as they say? It's not a native language in any community. What's your opinion on this?
That is true. It's just a linguistic definition. And I have had videos where I protested that exact thing, which isn't exactly right. Any scientific or technical field will have its own jargon. And the jargon in the linguistics field is that a dead language is one without native speakers, without a native speaking community. Even though I know some parents who are raising their children to speak Latin bilingually, along with English or Italian or whatever else the other main native language is, there's no community of people. I think if you had a community of actual, children and everybody, people who are monolingual, modern Hebrew is an example of where something like that has occurred, then okay, then we would say the language isn't dead anymore. But does it matter? And is that something we even want? Because when people hear the term dead language, they think that means that nobody speaks it. And that's just not the case.
That's extinct languages, isn't it? There's a difference between.
Absolutely. I
Right.
would call those extinct languages. But I mean, what criteria is necessary to call it revived to the point of not being extinct anymore? Like ancient Egyptian. I know people who speak ancient Egyptian, not a lot of them. They know, but
Hmm.
they know Middle Egyptian as well as I know Latin. So
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
impressive people. Yeah.
Does
So
I mean, to the extent of community, does there have to be a physical community? With the rise of the internet, you can have a virtual community
and
of.
that's where most of it is, I'd say.
Yeah,
That's how
yeah.
we all stay in touch with each other.
Mm. Do you still keep in touch with the people you met at the Latin Conventiculum?
Absolutely.
You do.
Oh yes, and others that I've met only through interaction and collaboration. Um, uh, One in particular who's done some amazing translations into Latin of some songs I've done on Scorpio Martianus. Known him for forever, but met him originally just 13, 14 years ago through some forum where people were trying to speak or write Latin to one another back before. But we didn't, it's so interesting that we've used Zoom the entire world for a year because we all had to. And I'm like, this is normal. But really, this instantaneous free video chatting, high quality video and audio is pretty new. And that is something that we've taken advantage of.
Yeah. As a writer myself, do you think there's any sort of benefit of learning Latin to improve my understanding of English to make it better?
I
Is there
think
is there a positive
so.
causal link there?
I think there is, but it's at the same time. So we use Latin communicatively. We the be the whoever we are, we who do that, we have certain things that we say which are important party lines. They're not really a party line because there's no organization or something that says like this or that. But we tend to really de-emphasize the utilitarian value or necessity that's ascribed to Latin or ancient Greek, because why learn classical piano? Yeah, you could have a job at it, but it's edifying. It's made you who you are.
Mm.
You'd be the great person without it, probably, but you would not be the same Anthony, I would think. Just like, for me, if I didn't know Latin, if I hadn't had the chance to study ancient Greek, would I feel the same? No. I mean, not only would it be a very different course in my own life and my activities, but I just wouldn't have the same things I've connected with, which are how I feel and how I express myself and how I interact with the world. Um, Remind me, I went off topic. Sorry. What?
Oh, it's okay. If I learned Latin, would that help and
Oh
benefit
yes,
my?
but thank you. That said, I think that because so many authors of our literature consciously, knowing Latin and French, for example, imported so much of those languages accidentally, I suppose, at first with the development of Middle English, right after the Norman invasion, 1066. Then consciously, the deliberate choice to bring in more French words and expressions, and then more Latin, the cultural connection. Everybody's studying Latin in the authorial circles in England throughout the Renaissance and thereafter, so that the words and expressions and the way we use them is based so much on that. That, for
Mm.
example, when I have the choice between synonyms, some are from Latin or maybe from Greek. Now, since I know what they actually mean in the language, that can help me choose. Oh, I want to use this word and not that one because
Mm.
it has a more precise meaning. And I know how to use that in the original language. Now, that doesn't mean English wouldn't use the words differently, because it does that all the time with Latin words. So that's not like the word repeat, for example. We usually don't use that to mean to repeat in Latin. It means to kind of physically go back to something. It doesn't usually mean to say something again, which is how we usually mean the word repeat. As an
Uh,
example. But for the most part, they do. So I think, yes. For me, it felt like I was seeing the Matrix. I felt like Neo. I felt like, oh, now I understand what everything is, what all these words mean. I felt like instantly comfortable with English in a way I never was before. That was my experience. But um, I would be very reticent to say that there is a significant utilitarian value.
mm. Okay, I better get them Latin books out.
Yeah, you got it.
Would you agree with the statement that it's impossible to avoid learning about history when you're learning a language? Would you say?
Oh,
Would you agree?
oh yeah, I strongly agree.
Mm.
Yeah, you can see it, especially with when dealing with an ancient one, but even a modern one.
Mm. That leads me to my next question. How has the study of Latin influenced your view of the modern world?
Oh yeah, pantarrhi. It's a little ancient Greek philosophy. It means everything flows, everything changes. But what once was is again as well as something that occurs to me. Yeah, I think one of the most studied parts of history probably is that first century BC, the civil wars of the Roman Republic, and of course the wars abroad, and Caesar, and the change of what we call the Republic into the Roman Empire. All of that is really well studied because it seems to have a lot of cautionary tales. It seems to have a lot of really positive examples of statesmanship. Has so many things going on in it. You could see something there and be like, oh wow, that's informative on what is going on in this country or that country at the moment, or this particular. It could be even in your own hometown, like, oh, this thing is happening and this reminds me of that situation. um so it's yeah, I think for the most part, what it does for me is it shows, when I get to read the stuff in the original, and the desire then to speak the languages with some fluency, is that, oh, this is a language of mine. This is a way that I express myself. And now I'm reading these authors. They're talking to me. They're talking to anyone who would ever read them. And I happen to be among that audience, as anyone is who can read them, not in translation, but in the original. And because of that, we get that we get the ability to really feel connected with that past in an amazing way. So it feels like, oh, this is just happening yesterday, and that's
Mm.
amazing.
I think I agreed with you. I think you were on um, Norbert on Ecolinguists
Hmm.
live chat. You said something that really resonated with me. It's that I think you were talking in regards to the potential Martian colony on SpaceX, and you said that learning about the ancient past makes you appreciate where we are right now.
Oh, enormously. Oh yeah, we romanticize the past too much. um Maybe there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that attitude still exists to some degree in the classics communities, like, oh, the ancient Roman and Greek times were so much better, or even the idea that the languages were superior. I don't see that. There's certain things that Latin and ancient Greek can only do, and I think that's especially in the poetry. But there's an old and highly or an easily disproven notion that languages are like decaying or something, and like they're getting simple or simpler. That's not true. There are processes that are always happening. Like English seems modern English seems relatively simple with respect to Old English. Because if we think language is grammatical morphology, if we think that's what language is, then the conclusion that Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and English, which are all came from languages with a case system, and all these other seemingly more complicated things, our impression would be that, oh, languages are just getting dumber, or they're getting simpler, or something, or whatever. And people think, oh, well, these other ancient languages, these were better. But English has, despite its morphological simplicity, I mean, Swedish is yet simpler with that kind of thing. There's no present tense verb conjugation difference at all with that language. So, but does that mean language is less capable of communicating? No. So where does we have more nuances? We have, for example, a lot of our meaning in English is with subtle vowel variations. We have a lot of information packed into consonants, for example, whereas Romance languages, or Japanese, there's a great example. You have consonant, vowel as the basic structure of it. So the words seem longer, and they are for that reason. So there's all these different factors which go into that. And I forget why I started going on that tangent. Give me on track, Anthony.
Yes. No, I like where we're going. I like where we're going. To the argument that people say, languages are becoming simpler. A thought came to me that could it be very similar to how we view sort of evolution in general and sort of technology in general? As say for example, computer was very big back in the day, lots of bits and bobs, lots of extra things, and as time went on, things start become chipped away. You don't need this. We can make this smaller. This is more efficient. Could you say that language is evolving similar to that? Things like excess things that we don't need can just be cut away, and then as culture develops and people develop through that culture, could it be that humans are just becoming more aware as to what language is and how we can make it more efficient? So I think there's not simpler in a way, not simpler as in in the bad sense, but in a more efficient sense.
Well, I think there's an argument one can make for that. But I don't see that in the 2,000-year span of, say, classical Latin to the modern English or other modern languages. And I don't see that because, I mean, I have whole relationships and friendships, which I've enjoyed for years, only in Latin. And there's no need for the modern language, except if it's like a truly like technical term, which in foreign languages, we would use an English computer term anyway, probably. Yeah, I don't think there's a reason to say that's incorrect per se, especially on really long time scales. But on something like 2,000 years, it seems long, but it's really not that much when it comes to the human experience.
Yes. And just a last question to round this conversation, this fantastic conversation off. In your own opinion, in your own view, where do you see the future of Latin?
I think it's going to keep growing and the way it is now. More people are going to learn to speak it, to be able to read it with comfortable fluency, to become less dependent on the grammar translation method. Yeah, I don't see any, it's not like we're waiting for something to happen. We're not, there's no like critical mass of anything, unless people are really dedicated to making a native language environment, like the case of modern Hebrew, for example, which I don't see anybody really trying to do anything like that anytime soon. We'll just see more of what we've had, which have been great. More opportunities for spoken Latin immersion will be developed because there will simply be more of a market for it. More people want to try to do it. There will be more, yeah, and thanks to all the tools we have, the internet, the content that's being created, it's just going to, I think it's just going to slowly keep on going. And there's going to be wonderfully more people in the world, and therefore there simply will statistically be more people who will have the chance to learn. I don't think it's necessarily for anyone, just like I wouldn't say that, oh yeah, everybody should learn Japanese. I mean, it's super interesting and I love Japanese, but there's no reason to learn a language, I don't think, unless you really want to get access to what that language provides historically or culturally.
Mr. Luke Ranieri, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony.